But a more exciting announcement before I introduce our next presenters is that as I look out around this room, I recall a moment, it feels like 1,000 years ago in a galaxy far, far away, when Kelly Reiner and I got together to decide to do something like this. And when we did, there were 30 people in the room. And today, as Jenny Nevin, our COO of the Themed Entertainment Association, says, we are at 550 people today. So very, very well done to all of you. And because of that, we have 1,650, and Jenny, if I'm wrong, please correct me, 1,650 member countries, member companies from around the world. And that deserves a big applause to our TEA. Now, we wing our way to North Island, New Zealand, where the Te Papa National Museum of New Zealand collaborated with Weta Workshops on Gallipoli, The Scale of Our War, which takes home an AOA museum exhibit on a limited budget. The brilliance of this exhibition is the emotional connection and the ingenious presentation of 8 sculpted figures crafted 2.5 times human scale and hyper-real detail, telling the epic of New Zealand's commitment to World War I and its huge cost in human life. The exhibit includes artifacts, full-scale mock-ups, and animated models with time-lapse projection. Please welcome from Te Papa director Ian Crowe and 5-time award-winning Weta Workshop CEO and co-founder Sir Richard Taylor. Gentlemen.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here with you. It's a great day. Richard and I are here from New Zealand. This is the time when you wish you had a map. A country of 4.5 million. We're from Wellington, the capital city, which is a city of 450,000. And I'm here from Te Papa, our national museum, to talk about an exhibition that has touched the hearts, minds, and lives of a huge number of people over the last 3 years. Gallipoli, The Scale of Our War, tells the real story of real men and women who fought in a doomed campaign during World War I that became a key part of forging the national identity of New Zealand. The exhibition talks to the reality and suffering of war through the eyes of the people who experienced it. We see our visitors connect with their hearts to the stories. Many are moved to tears. Seeing this impact we are having through the experience is really quite incredibly humbling. It really makes you think. As Te Papa and our place as a National Museum, we wanted to do something special to mark the centenary of World War I, to bring to life the experiences of Gallipoli to a new generation in a way that would bring a profound understanding about this moment in our past. So to create the exhibition, we didn't look for exhibition builders. We wanted to work with world builders. So we partnered with the multi-Oscar-winning Weta Workshop, led by Sir Richard Taylor. And Richard, along with our curators and our then head of design, Ben Berard, who happens to be here today, and I told him that I was going to make him stand up just to embarrass him. So please stand up, Ben. Who was the lead designer for Gallipoli, and now surprisingly works for Richard at Weta, but that's another story. This amazing team collaborated together, giving their deep knowledge and creative brilliance to bring the exhibition to life. So I'm going to stand aside to let Richard take you through the incredible creative process. Richard.
Hello everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here. This is the first time I've been part of this, and it feels very special to be here today talking to you all. My wife Tania and I set up our company 30 years ago in Wellington, New Zealand, in an effort to service the creative industries of our city over the years our company has grown, and we now have 350 fellow colleagues that are servicing the world's creative industries as much as we can, with handcrafted skills complemented with robotic manufacturing, and it makes for a wonderful environment in our workshop down in the city that we live in. We do a bit more than working on film, which we're probably best known for. We publish our own books. We have a tourism offering in our small city. We get 140,000 people through our 3 tourist events. We have a consumer products division and been manufacturing in China for the last 20 years. We have a children's television production company. We've produced many shows, and we have a co-production partnership out of China making children's TV. We're making the first ever mixed reality game for the Magic Leap platform. We've been working on that for the last 5 years. We have a design studio, and we design on over 50 major films, TV shows, or other projects a year, and then get to manufacture on a few of those each year. But we also have a location-based experience division, and my dear friend and colleague, Rick Aythorne, that runs this division, is with me here today. And it is through this part of our business that we had the great pleasure of interacting with Te Papa. Te Papa had already been working towards this exhibition, and I got a call in the middle of the night from the head of the board of Te Papa, and he asked me if I would please take over running the exhibition. And I thought about it, and I went back to him the next day, and I said that I would on 2 prerequisites, and that was that we were allowed to start again, which was a bit scary because we only had 8 months, and it would be throwing away a number of months of work, and that they promoted Ben Berard, who was head of design at the time, but not head of the project, because that was a position held more traditionally by the curators and educators at a national museum. And they did indeed go and do that, and they promoted the head of design to the head of the project, which seemed entirely appropriate to me, as any good project should be led by good design. And that's where we started. So what I'd like to do is share with you how we came about what we did for this wonderful project. I consider, and this is obviously saying something, working on movies like Lord of the Rings and Avatar and District 9 and such like, but this is truly the seminal project in my career, as I probably imagine it is for many of the team that work with me, due to the importance of the subject matter, the reverence of the memory of the men and women that served, and the impact that it has had on our country. So if you would please play down the video, Joe, thank you. So a great collaboration. We called it Gallipoli, the Scale of Our War. We appreciated when we started the project that most people in our country probably only knew a small amount about this infamous campaign, mainly through sepia-toned, old, battered black and white photographs of a past-gone era. We realized that if we were to truly engage with our audience, we had to do something special. And we, of course, started thinking about how that would have an impact. We thought about who's achieved stories of military past in an emboldened way, and that was through Time Life magazine. So we started to gather our thoughts, and in turn started to think about how we tell the story of these very ordinary people that went into extraordinary circumstances. So we decided to deliver them as pillars of our past at scale, so they would have impact and purpose in the exhibition. Everything starts with good design, and like always, I turn to our team at the Weta Workshop as Ben turned to his team, and we began conceptualizing and engaging around the subject matter. Of course, lots and lots of meetings with the experts, with the wonderful curators at Te Papa, with the educationalists, and with Ben. We thought that typography had to lead our exhibition. Even if an audience of a certain demographic were to run through the exhibition, it was important to us that the information told through pictograms and bold typography would leave an impacting message in their minds enough that should they leave the exhibition, having not bothered to study the detail, they still would have grasped the core of the subject matter. But should people wish to dive deep, we also created a thoroughly engaging educational information across the history of this campaign. Of course, I have the great pleasure of being able to turn to our manufacturing facility at the Weta Workshop, which has all of the resources necessary to take on something of this scale. To achieve the project, we first of all did a nationwide casting call to find the actors that we felt best represented them, and then we photographed them to capture the essence of every one of the tableaus, and selected each of these photographs with great care and thoughtfulness. Then it's into the scanning department where we began to gather all of the resources that we needed for reference into face and arm casting so that we get a poor level of reference that we can use for our future sculpting process. Of course, time is galloping on at this stage. The 3D department then takes over and takes digital scans while we use our home-built 3D printing machines to print the internal cores of the sculptures and begin to mill the plasticine components that are going to be the final sculptures. We even print botanically accurate flies that were appeared on the peninsula at the time, and these bring great delight to the little kiddies when they try and spot the flies all over the poor soldiers. Into sculpting, and our team of 8 sculptors begin the multiple-month process of turning these raw plasticine mills into hyper-realistic physical sculptures. You can't copy exactly what is in human form because you have to overblow the detail so it's not lost in the silicon. And at 2.4 times life size, it has the impact necessary to sell the emotion and the realism to the audience when it's finally seen through the exhibition. But that's indeed what the sculptors achieved. Then the usual process into silicon matrix moulding, using clay to create the mother mould that will eventually be matrix moulded and then replaced with silicon. Into those moulds we pour a high-level silicon rubber that will replace the clay and ultimately give us the hyper-realistic skins that are the basis from which we begin to paint. A young woman on our staff is a master painter, and she begins the process of building up the impression of subsurface scattering in the flesh, while of course every other department similarly is starting to paint all of the props, the sets and all the other components. Even the eyeballs, 3D printed, then cast with corneal bulges to distort the lid edge to give the correct form of the eye. The most tedious part of the project, of course, hair punching, and on heads of this scale, using horsehair, yak hair, dog hair, human hair, and cat's whiskers for eyelashes, we begin the long and arduous process of putting all of this together. Not a single cat's whisker plucked in the process, though. And But spare a moment's thought for the costumers. Many people are fascinated by the silicon process, but that is nothing compared to the process of making the costumes, the boots, the props, etc. Everything scaled to 2.4 times scale. We had to weave fabric 2.4 times larger. We had to spin wool with a denier of 2.4 times the roughness so we could get the pilling correct, the texture correct on the costumes. And of course, every soldier carries weapons. It was my insistence to our team that should a military expert see the uniforms or see the weapons, under no circumstances could they tell them apart should they see a photograph of them. And that became a sort of a millimetre by millimetre process of accurately reproducing these things. We also used miniatures. We jumped scales. In some cases, we 3D printed our miniatures. Where we ran out of time, we used toy soldiers that we purchased. But all of them created the illusion of these worlds, including a cross-section of the Mahino ship, which showed the medical ship that went to the war to deliver the soldiers back to New Zealand, and equally made with love and care by our craftspeople on the workshop floor. And into assembly. For months and months at this stage, I've been trying to convince the board of Te Papa and some of our staff to not worry that when these figures came together, because no one had seen them other than in disparate parts, that they would contain the emotional intent that we had talked about all those months earlier. So this was a very rewarding moment for me, where I could finally see them come together in front of everyone, and everyone saw what they had all been working on and what had been in my head all this time. None of this could be possible, of course, unless lots of companies come together, and all the digital content, the archiving, the extraordinary work to put the educational work behind it came from, of course, the wonderful people at Te Papa, but also other companies across Wellington, and the scenic artistry, the in-depth design that we did, the research and all of the development was an incredible collaboration between an extraordinary group of people, Ben's graphic design team, but no one more important than the wonderful Christopher Pugsley, who was our military expert, and everyone should have a Christopher on their projects. One of the things I was insistent on from the beginning is that our exhibition would have an original symphonic soundtrack composed for the exhibition. We turned to Tane Upjohn Beatson, a young composer from Wellington, using the voices of local actors, and then using our New Zealand Symphonic Orchestra. He put together a 1.5-hour original composition that helps manipulate the emotions of our audience as they journey through the exhibition. And the power of the music in the exhibition has a resonance when you walk through. Finally, the days of installation. We always build maquettes, physical maquettes, to communicate everything that we want to build. It was actually lovely coming to the hotel to see a beautiful maquette in the foyer of the hotel here. But that informs everything that Ben and I wanted in the art direction of the environment, and we utilize that right down to a printed floor that signifies the loss of life of New Zealanders on every day of the war. Then finally the figures go in and the exhibition is almost ready to open. So why the 8 figures that we chose? It was because of their diaries. Westmacott, one of the first men on the peninsula, he's shot in the upper shoulder. He ultimately loses his arm to gangrene. That injury probably saved his life because of the incredible fatality rate of the New Zealanders on the peninsula. But he remembers it as the best day of his life. Lottie went to Gallipoli to see her brother Letty, her much-loved brother, but on arriving she's given a pile of letters wrapped in a red ribbon, and on the front of each is stamped, killed, returned to sender. And at that moment she discovers that her much-loved brother has passed. The Māori contingent, the first time that Māori got to fight alongside their white brothers in a war, and they played a massive part in the fierce resolve that they brought to this moment. And here's a machine gun post of Riki Hana-Kakik and Friday Hawkins at the machine gun, both injured in that moment. This is one of the doctors, one of only 3 on the peninsula. He had to make decisions every day who would live and who would die, because some of the men sitting talking to him couldn't be saved. He ultimately had a psychological breakdown. And Dunn, a really powerful, strong, brave soldier, got dysentery and pneumonia, but checked himself off the ship to go back to help his mates, fell asleep at his post, court-martialed to death by a British commander. And then finally, the final figure is representative of the men that didn't go home to a glorious welcome. They went to the Somme, where they were invariably annihilated in that war. Our effort was to build an educational exhibition, also a commemorative exhibition, an exhibition that shows deep respect to the families that visit. Many families will go and pray to the figures, they'll cuddle the figures, they'll cry in front of the figures. An elderly man came up to me, 79 years old, and he said, all I can think to do is go into a corner and weep, because his relatives had been in this war. We asked people to lay poppies at the feet of the final soldier, and to date over 1.5 million poppies have been laid, most people writing a message in those poppies. And without doubt, my favourite one is, I am sorry soldier, sleep well, we love you, from a 7-year-old girl. Since the exhibition opened, we've had an incredible number of people. Remember, we're from a country of 4.5 million people. I've just been told that I've actually got this statistic wrong, because in 2 days, 2 million people would have gone through the exhibition. So half of our country's population has ultimately gone through the exhibition and been part of the experience of acknowledging the loss of life and the bravery of these ordinary men and women that went to try and preserve a way of life in New Zealand. We remember Gallipoli not as a campaign, but as a moment in our history that turned us from a colony of England into a country in our own right. The 1.5 million people that lived in New Zealand at the time realized the insanity of this war, realized the terrible loss, and realized that a huge part of the bloodstock, the young men of New Zealand, had just been decimated for no gain. And that caused a catalytic reaction that within our parliament, within our people, we began to separate and become an independent, thinking, operating country. So although this was a great loss of life, it ultimately catalyzed an extraordinary impact on our people and the country that we now enjoy for all of its freedoms, its lack of corruption, the fact that we've got the 3rd female Prime Minister who's also pregnant in our country, of which we're immensely proud of, and the forward-thinking place that we all have the pleasure to live in. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you both. We have time for questions. Does anybody have Kleenex? I'm sorry, I'm already having a moment over here.
I know that.
Thank you. We have.
Would you like to ask a quick? He's waiting.
Yes, let's wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you.
I know that chap. He came and
Richard.
visited our workshop, which was very nice.
Chuck Foster from Animax Design. So I had the pleasure of seeing this exhibition back in December, and it really moved me when I went there. And I'm finding myself getting choked up right now even talking about it, which was the same feeling that I had going through it. And being an American and not really having a connection to this war or the people of New Zealand, it still had that impact. And watching your presentation and looking at how you went through the process of designing this and choosing things such as the 2.4 times scale, I think choices like that magnified the impact to such a degree, combined with the hyper-realism that you brought into the sculpture of the characters. Every detail was there. And we often talk in our business where we're doing animatronic characters, or in this case, static characters, about that uncanny valley. And if you try to attempt to reproduce a human, it's very risky, and usually that results in failure. And in this case, it was very much the opposite of that. So I'm curious for the audience today if you could comment on what sort of pointed you at that decision for 2.4 times scale, and what are the challenges that you have as a company to be able to control that creative process so that that uncanny valley isn't the result at the end, but rather it's the result that you achieved.
Well, thank you, Chuck. That's a nice question to answer. After saying yes to the exhibition, and could we please come up with our own idea? And the reason I asked that is not because I'm an egotist and needed to imprint this with my own thing, or want Ben and I to do our own thing. It's because I felt very strongly that you couldn't tell the story of soldiers with pathos by telling the story of a whole army, because a whole army becomes a faceless story, where if you pluck out individuals from that army and tell the intimacy of their individual story, and what's more, if you can tell it through their own voices by taking almost a recording of them, which is their written word in their diary. Almost every soldier kept a diary. We were able to find the voices for the exhibition. Very hard when you're speaking from 100 years ago and you can't go and record people, you can't film them, but they do have a way to speak to you across time. And Rick and myself then sat down and we were in our design room, and like always, I had a whiteboard pen in my hand, and we spent maybe an hour or so sketching on the whiteboard, and I drew a picture of a soldier, large, in fact, holding a newspaper with someone scaled down in front of it. And I started thinking about this and riffing with Rick, and out of that came Gallipoli, the scale of our war, and the idea that we would instigate an exhibition built around figures. We then ran it past Ben at Te Papa, and he thought it was a good idea that we should start to develop this together. And we then took that to the board in the form of a whole pile of artwork. And they bought into it, which was lovely. The scale of the figures cause you to arrest your moments, travel through the exhibition and contemplate the figures. The figures connect with you through their eyes, through their grief, through their weight of purpose, through their gallantry, their camaraderie, their loss, and achieve a connection that we were hoping we could do. How do we control the art process? The great benefit of trying to keep everything under one roof, which I imagine, Chuck, you can totally relate to, as I'm sure many artisans running their own workshop in the room entirely appreciate too. We will farm nothing out unless it is absolutely imperative, unless we don't have a piece of super expensive equipment that we can't do it ourselves. We won't farm it out, because the gentleman that just showed the previous exhibition, the paintings that are on the architecture of the mines, they are paintings that have been painted from a single palette with a single brush stroked across the canvas by a single artist. The more you dissipate the artistic intent in the process of construction, the further you get away from the use of the single palette and the touch of the single brush on the canvas. And I very much am of the view that as long as we can control it under the one roof, in the one building, where everyone is focused on the artisan approach, no one is rushing to prove that they've got superiority in creativity, or they can do it better, or one technique's better than the other. We just quietly discuss what we think is the innovative methodology or the traditional handcraft required to achieve the end result, and then we set about achieving that. And we turn, as always, to the extraordinary people around us and their ability to craft these things. My job from that point is relatively simple, because I just tap the art directorial journey of that sculpture and then try and influence the innovative, creative thought of how we're going to actually do it. But it is the artists that are empowered to achieve that, and the work that Chuck's relating to, and the ability to bring them together at the end with that singular purpose is because the artists think as one, do as one, create as one, and can achieve as one. And that's what we ultimately see in an exhibition such as this. I just make comment about Ben's work. One of the things I said to Ben, as corny as it is, and maybe it's too obtuse, but I call it the Burger King and McDonald's problem. I think we all face it. By that I mean, whether it's a beautiful movie we've worked on, or an incredible exhibition, or a theme park, what's the first thing in the audience's mind on leaving? Is it Burger King or McDonald's for lunch? Have I got my lunch ready for my children? Do I have to pick up hubby? Have I got my wife's Christmas present? Modern life is pouring through people's heads, and how do you distance them from their modern lives to give them a moment of reprieve by giving them something that causes them to only think in the moment about what they're experiencing and not be thinking about their exterior lives. Something I said to Ben at the very beginning, create a labyrinth. We only had a very small piece of real estate to do this exhibition. And what's worse, the air conditioning units for the National Museum were in the middle of the exhibition. But I said to Ben, no straight lines. The men never saw straight lines, and create a labyrinth. And what Ben went on to create in the form of his production design was the most extraordinary twisting, turning, convoluted experience that takes you on a linear journey that I would argue within 5 minutes, and Chuck, you can counter me if you do, because you've been to the exhibition, you entirely forget about what's for lunch, what's happening in your outside life, what's going to happen tomorrow, because you get lost in the story. And that's a huge tribute to the incredibly fine choreography that Ben put in to the journey of the exhibition. And I see that invisible part of it as a very, very critical part of why people come out at the end just so drenched in the subject matter and so feeling at one with the content. So.
Richard, why don't we embarrass Rick and have you introduce him? He's here in the audience today, correct?
Yeah,
Rick,
yeah.
that you're...
Be lovely if...
Let's embarrass Rick
We'll
for a
get Rick.
moment.
So Rick might stand up too. Up you get, Rick. So Rick
There he
Aythorne.
is.
So Rick was an interloper last year. He actually came to the event last year and came home and told us all about it. And I said to Rick, God, wouldn't it be amazing to attend next year? And wouldn't it be amazing if we ever won one of those awards? And
Thank you, Richard. Ian, I know you have a teammate here as well. Why don't we take a moment to introduce her?
To Liz Hay, who's part of our touring team that's here as well. Liz over there.
Thank you. We have a question in the back. Name and company, please.
Hi, Clara. I met you earlier from JRA.
Hi, Clara.
One of the things that really struck me when I watched Building Gallipoli, which for those of you who don't know, they have a 6-part version of this on the Weta YouTube channel, which is amazing, is the fact that many New Zealanders had never met a Maori until they got to Gallipoli. And can you talk a little bit more about incorporating the Maori into your story and the part that they played in helping develop that story with you?
Yeah, we pride ourselves, like any country that the settlers, especially British settlers, had subjugated the indigenous people at the time of settlement. We obviously have issues in our country, but I would be bold enough on the stage to say proudly that we probably have the most harmonious relationship between Indigenous New Zealand people, the Māori, and the other immigrants that live in New Zealand. Remember, we're a very young country of only about 280 years. And the Māori people, our Deputy Prime Ministers are Māori. Māori people hold the highest places of business in our country. In some cases, and every place name in the country, bar the main cities, is Māori. The kids of New Zealand have to learn Māori compulsory because we're so proud of our culture. But at the time of this war, the Māori had never got to serve, and they actually campaigned government to be allowed to go and serve. And the Māori people played a major part in this campaign, and therefore, of course, we needed to turn very, very significantly to the Māori advisors, firstly at Te Papa and then outside of Te Papa, to help us establish the importance of this part of the story. And it's a very impacting and powerful Indigenous story within the Gallipoli greater time frame that we were able to tell. So there's a subtext running through the exhibition that celebrates the extraordinary people that are the Indigenous people of New Zealand.
And on that incredible note, thanks to both Richard and to Ian. Incredible presentation. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.